They never taught you this about Africa. Not in school. Not on television. Not in the textbooks written far from our soil. And if you feel a quiet anger rising as I say that, it is because somewhere deep inside, you already know it is true. From the first day you learn history, Africa was introduced as a problem, a place of absence. No timelines of our empires. No chapters on our systems of law, trade, or governance before foreign flags arrived. You were shown images of hunger before images of knowledge. You were taught outcomes without causes, wounds without the hands that made them. And then they asked you to accept that version as neutral. Friends, let me ask you plainly. If you were born Africa, do you believe you were taught the truth about your own continent? Because I was taught to admire maps that erased Africa, charts that reduced us, and narratives that trained us to explain ourselves instead of standing upright. I was taught that progress always came from elsewhere, that solutions had foreign accents, and that dignity was something we would receive later if we behaved. This is not an accident. It is design. When a people are taught a broken version of their past, they negotiate badly in the present. When a child is trained to feel shame about where they come from, that child grows into an adult who accepts unfair terms just to be allowed inside the room. That is how control survives without chains. Pause here. If this feels uncomfortable, stay with me. If it feels familiar, write it down in the comments, say where you are watching from. Let this be a room where truth does not whisper. They told you Africa has no history, only survival. But survival is not our highest achievement. It is the evidence of what we endured. Before the first lecture about development, Africa traded across deserts and oceans. Before the first lecture about order, Africa governed millions with systems built for their realities. Before the first lecture about civilization, Africa produced knowledge that traveled outward, then returned with new names and foreign stamps. They never taught you that. Because a people who know their past do not accept permanent inferiority. And here is the deeper wound. Many of us repeated those lessons to our own children. Not because we are weak, but because the cost of resistance felt high and the reward felt distant. Fear works best when it sounds reasonable. Fear says, not now. Fear says, be careful. Fear says, this is how the world works. The effects Jesus, 14 Equatus. But fear has never built a future for Africa. If you are listening from Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Johannesburg, or from London, Paris, New York, Toronto, ask yourself this. How much of what you believe about Africa came from people who benefit when Africa doubts itself? In the next chapter, I will dismantle the most persistent lie of all, the lie of the poor continent. Stay with me. Subscribe now if you want the truth before it gets rewritten again. Let me confront the most insulting sentence ever spoken about Africa. Africa is poor. Tiescaline. Say it slowly, and listen to how absurd it sounds. Africa is not poor. Africa has been made poor. Deliberately, systematically, and profitably. If Africa were poor, the world would not be fighting over it. If Africa were poor, foreign armies would not camp on our soil. If Africa were poor, multinational corporations would not risk coups, sanctions, and wars to keep their access. You cannot call a house empty while you are stealing furniture from it every night. Africa produces over 70% of the world's cobalt, the mineral that powers electric vehicles and smartphones. Africa supplies uranium that lights cities thousands of kilometers away. Africa exports gold, oil, gas, diamonds, lithium, manganese, cacao, cotton, the raw spine of the global economy. And yet we are told Africa is poor. No, we are stripped. We are told Africa cannot develop, but Africa has never been allowed to keep value. We export raw materials, cheap. They return, refined, expensive, and controlled. We dig. They price. We bleed. They brand. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is a system. And here is the part that should make you angry. They trained us to feel ashamed of this lie. Ashamed when someone calls Africa backward. Profitsprenen. Ashamed when aid is announced as if it were generosity, not compensation. Ashamed when our leaders are paraded as beggars at global summits. Some of you watching this nodded along for years because resisting felt lonely. Because saying, this is theft made you sound extreme. Because asking for control made you sound dangerous. That shame was cultivated. Because a people who feel ashamed of their wealth will never defend it. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If Africa is poor, why does leaving Africa make others rich? If Africa is poor, why do our currencies collapse when commodity prices rise? If Africa is poor, why are foreign profits guaranteed while African lives are collateral? Poverty is not our condition. Poverty is our assigned role, and roles can be rejected. This is why every attempt at nationalization is called radical. This is why every demand for fair pricing is called market disruption. In fraud. This is why every African leader who says no is labeled unstable. Because the lie must be protected. And listen to me carefully now. God did not create Africa to be a warehouse for others. God did not place wealth under Africa's soil so others could decide its destiny. What was stolen can be reclaimed, but only by those who refuse to bow. So I ask you, answer this in the comments, without fear. Have you ever felt anger when outsiders call Africa the poor continent? And who do you think benefits most from that lie? External powers, or internal leaders who enforce it? Write your country below. Let us see how wide this awakening already is. To understand the lie of poverty, you are forced to face the next truth. Fear is the tool that keeps it alive. Now that you see the lie of the poor continent, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who controls the game? Because poverty does not operate alone. It needs managers. It needs rules. It needs referees who always blow the whistle against the same side. Let me be precise. Africa is not trapped by chaos. Africa is trapped by systems. Look at the contracts. Look at the currencies. Look at the rules we never wrote, but are forced to obey. Take the so-called financial discipline imposed by institutions like IMF. They call it stabilization. I call it sedation. Loans arrive with conditions. Cut public spending. Freeze wages. Open markets. Sell national assets. And when people suffer, they say reform takes time. Time for whom? Not for the mother who cannot afford food. Not for the farmer crushed by imported subsidies. Not for the youth told to be patient while their future is exported. Then there is the currency chain, the CFA system. A currency printed outside Africa. Reserves locked abroad. Monetary policy decided without consent. They call it stability. But stability for whom? A currency that rewards imports and punishes production. A currency that keeps economies obedient by design. And then there is the narrative. Media that speaks about Africa, never with Africa. Resistance framed as instability. Compliance framed as maturity. A leader who obeys becomes moderate. A leader who resists becomes authoritarian. This is not journalism. This is conditioning. But here is the uncomfortable truth. None of this works without internal collaborators. External power cannot rule Africa alone. It needs African signatures, African voices, African uniforms. Not every enemy speaks with a foreign accent. Some wear our flags. To identify who controls the game, you must confront how fear is used to keep it running. Let us confront the most dangerous myth sold to Africa. That obedience brings safety. We were told, comply and you will be protected. Sign and you will be supported. Obey and you will be rewarded. History proves the opposite. Every time Africa obeyed, it did not become safer. It became poorer, more fragile, more dependent. When we followed the rules, we were praised. When we stayed quiet, we were labeled stable, crocodiles. And what did stability give Africa? More debt, weaker industries, youth without work. Obedience did not build hospitals. It trained us to wait. Wait for aid. Wait for approval. Wait for permission. Fear made this cycle possible. Fear whispers, not now. If you connotation. Fear convinces leaders that survival is better than dignity. But ask yourself this. Did obedience protect those who obeyed before us? Those who complied were still abandoned. Those who followed orders were still punished. Obedience buys time, never freedom. And time, when wasted, becomes theft. God did not create Africa to kneel forever. Something changed in the Sahel, and it did not ask for permission. For decades, Africa was expected to negotiate its dignity quietly. Smile for the cameras. Sign the papers. Accept the conditions. Then the Sahel said no. Not as a slogan, as a decision. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about structure. What happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is not personality worship. It is a rupture in behavior. a refusal to continue as a managed space. The AS bloc did not emerge to impress anyone. It emerged to survive. When sanctions arrived, the bloc did not collapse. When isolation followed, it adapted. When pressure intensified, it coordinated. That is the shock. Not defiance for applause, coordination for leverage. This is why names matter only as signals, not saviors. Traore did not invent resistance. Goita did not awaken history. They stepped into a moment where the old script stopped working. And the moment demanded clarity. The Sahel did not ask, how do we look? Wine, whiz. It asked, how do we live? D. One military posture replaced 3 fragmented ones. One development bank replaced dependency theater. One media strategy challenged a narrative monopoly. This is not rebellion. This is statecraft under pressure. For the first time in a long time, Africans watched governments move from victimhood to authorship, from reaction to initiative, from apology to position. And that terrified the system. Because once Africa learns to say no together, the price of coercion multiplies. Sanctions become blunt. Threats lose clarity. Divide and rule weakens. Let me be precise. The Sahel model is not perfect. It is not finished. It is not immune to failure. But it does something radical. It changes the direction of accountability. Instead of asking, what will donors say? Thanks for watching. It asks, what will our people endure? And crustiny. Instead of optimizing for headlines abroad, it optimizes for survival at home. That shift from external validation to internal obligation is the real revolution. And this is why the backlash is so loud. Not because the Sahel is reckless, but because it demonstrates something contagious. That Africa can negotiate as a bloc. That Africa can set conditions. That Africa can absorb pain without surrendering agency. This is not about one region winning. It is about a precedent spreading. When one country resists, it is isolated. When 3 coordinate, the system recalculates. So ask yourself and answer honestly. If this model fails, will it be because Africans rejected it? Or because the cost of independence was deliberately inflated? And if it succeeds, who loses control? They ask us a question that sounds reasonable, almost compassionate. Do you want stability or do you want sovereignty? If you want to see, as if the two were enemies, as if dignity were reckless, as if obedience were peace. Let me speak plainly. Africa has tried stability at any price. We paid with silence. We paid with resources. We paid with the future of our children. And what did we receive? Calm cemeteries, orderly poverty, predictable humiliation. Stability that demands submission is not stability. It is anesthesia. They say, be patient. Frangians. They say, this is not the right time. They say, change slowly or you will suffer. I'm sower. But look at our history. We suffered while we waited. We suffered while we complied. We suffered while we prayed for approval that never came. So let me ask you quietly, honestly, if suffering is unavoidable, should it be the price of obedience or the cost of becoming free? Because sovereignty is not cheap. It never was. Every people who stood upright paid something first, not because they were reckless, but because systems do not loosen their grip voluntarily. They want Africa calm, not conscious, predictable, not principled, manageable, not meaningful. They fear instability, they say. But whose instability? The instability of markets? Or the instability of injustice finally exposed? Here is where faith enters, not as decoration, but as judgment. God did not create a continent to kneel forever. God did not design a people to be permanent suppliers of raw pain. Scripture never promised comfort to those who walk in truth. It promised presence. Dignity has always required sacrifice, but humiliation guarantees decay. This is the moral line they never want us to cross. Because once a people decides that dignity is worth discomfort, fear stops working, sanctions lose their magic, threats lose their leverage, isolation loses its terror. Now I am speaking to you directly, not as a spectator, not as a commentator, but as family. If you are African by blood and living in the West, this part is for you. You grew up hearing 2 stories at the same time. One at home, whispered by parents and grandparents, stories of pride, struggle, memory. and another at school, on television, in policy papers, Africa as failure, Africa as charity, Africa as a permanent emergency. You were taught that Africa needs saving, and quietly, you were taught that you escaped. That contradiction fractures the soul, because no matter how successful you become abroad, something feels unresolved. You defend Africa in conversations, but with borrowed arguments. You feel pride, but also distance. You belong everywhere and nowhere completely. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When Africa stands up and disrupts the order that gave you opportunity, do you feel pride or anxiety? When sanctions are threatened, do you worry about Africa or about how it will look where you live? This is not accusation. It is recognition. The system trained you well. It rewarded assimilation, not allegiance. It taught you to love Africa culturally but fear it politically. And yet, when Africa moves today, something shifts inside you. Because deep down, you know this truth. Africa does not need to be saved. Africa needs to be respected. You were told that progress comes only from outside. That legitimacy is granted elsewhere. That stability requires supervision. But ask yourself honestly, who benefits when Africa is always the student and never the author? You are not neutral in this moment. None of us are. Silence is not safety. Distance is not innocence. We arrive at the moment many people avoid. Because awareness is comfortable, action is not. Knowing the truth does not change history. Choosing sides does. You have listened this far, which already separates you from the noise. But listening alone is not resistance. Understanding alone is not courage. So let me be clear about what comes next. You do not need permission. You do not need a title. You do not need to wait for a perfect leader. What Africa needs now is something more dangerous to power than protests or slogans. It needs organized consciousness. Start where you are. In your language. In your community. Challenge lies when you hear them, especially when they are repeated politely. Correct history when it is distorted, especially in small conversations. Support African voices, African media, African analysis, especially when algorithms try to bury them. This is not about shouting louder. It is about refusing to shrink. If you live on the continent, stop outsourcing responsibility to leaders alone. Power survives when citizens withdraw. Sovereignty is not a gift, it is a daily discipline. If you live in the diaspora, stop treating Africa like a memory or a cause. It is a living political reality. Your voice travels farther than you think. Your silence also speaks. And yes, this will cost you comfort. Truth always does. God never promised safety to people who walk upright. He promised presence. And history shows that no people who chose dignity were ever truly defeated, only delayed.